Suzanne, red one works. So, thank you. I appreciate it.
Oh. Yes. Oh. Yeah, we can go. We can go right now.
All right.
No? Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This is the City of Marion Community Equity Task Force meeting for Thursday, May 13th. Mayor is not able to join us today. He had a commitment and he's extending his apologies to everyone. So I'll be running the meeting today on his behalf. Alicia, if we can do a roll call, please.
Sorry if I butcher anyone's name. Lon Pluckon, Mike Kitzmiller.
Here.
Amal Ether.
Here.
Nicholas Abouassali. Colette Atkins. Steve Mosier.
Here.
Carlos Nelson. Al Rowe.
Here.
Maxwell Grant.
Here.
Frederick Brown.
Here.
Jennifer Tibbetts.
Here.
Mike Darrow. Thank you. Circe Stumbo. And that should be everyone.
Thank you. We'll go ahead and proceed with our agenda for today. First item on the agenda, I have approval of April 15th minutes. Motion.
So move. Second.
It's been moved and seconded to approve minutes for April 15th meeting. Discussion. Anybody had a chance to review the minutes? No discussion. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Oppose, same sign. Motion passes. We'll move ahead to second item on the agenda. We have policing subcommittee update. Steve or Al, you want to give us an update, or Circe?
We met 2 weeks ago. Is that correct? Your mic on. Oh. There we go. Can you hear now? All right, there's Jennifer. Good, thanks. So yeah, we met 2 weeks ago at the police department headquarters, and let's see if I remember. It was Steve, Al, myself, Chief, and Lon, and Joshua was there as a alternate. Did I miss anybody?
Me.
Amal was there.
Steve.
Amal was there, of course. Thank you. Did I miss anybody else? I didn't come prepared to give the update. Good first conversation. We didn't, we were more just getting a sense of, first time we were together face to face as a subcommittee, and sharing some of the information, the ideas, the work that we were looking at. Al had shared the framework we were talking about, and thinking about how that could practically be used in the work we were wanting to discuss in the subcommittee. I think we put out some of the ideas of some of the issues we'd like to address, but again, it was really just more of the first convening,
Introductory.
that sort of thing. But I'm sure I didn't capture important things, so if anyone else wants to chime in.
I can add something to it. Excuse me. I think going forward, and it's somewhat you had addressed it initially. Am I off or on? Oh, I'm sorry. I was kind of looking for the button and it wasn't the same one that was down there. But anyway, I think going forward in the subcommittee, we need to have a specific agenda for that subcommittee, and we need to have dates wrapped around those items in order to have objectives that we can reach and get back to. so that we can get back and report back to this committee as a whole, because we did a lot of talking and a lot of discussion, and I'm not saying we were all over the place, but there was a lot to cover in the time. And we were there for, I think, longer, Chief, than what you had anticipated that we were going to be there. We kind of went in. Yeah. So with an agenda, we can be more focused and we can take advantage of the opportunities that we are together. And then getting some kind of a structure around it. I think when Al and I had talked when we were either out golfing or in the parking lot, that to move this along, we have to put some hard stop dates and result orientated that we want to be able to achieve in order to show, excuse me, what we've accomplished, where we're going, and eventually to get back to the group as a whole, who has to get back to the council in general in order to, bless whatever we're doing and hopefully adopt what we're doing. So I think that's important for us to do that, at least in the subcommittees. And we sort of did it, but we didn't.
If I may add on to it, I believe we also discussed, the chief let us know that a few of the officers went to trainings, and I believe they were 2 hours apiece, Chief?
Yeah.
2 hours apiece, and that somebody wasn't able to come, but what they did was send officers to the trainings, take the training, bring it back, and then teach the trainings to the other officers. And I believe the two trainings were de-escalation and implicit bias. And so we talked about that. We also discussed different things about certain policies and trying to come up with certain ways to help the chief in certain situations that within the city. And also we had a conversation about ways that we could assist the chief when it comes to certain things regarding the school, or certain things regarding other organizations, if that's a piece that he needs to play in, that the police need to play in. But then we also had a conversation about what does it look like when dealing with injustice or racial equality, and what we're going to do about helping them help also with racial issues in the city as well. Am I correct, Ms. Cersei?
Correct, yes. Chief introduced us to policies currently are practiced in the department. And then we had a discussion, or a lengthy discussion, around the approach to the conversation. And we touched on the importance of partnerships and how we need to address with the community, and also engage the other entities that are also players, and all together we'll have a complete net system. So we'll be having to address the issue from the community approach, and also the structural approach, and the importance of the feedback loop. Because we are all together, we are all have a role to play in the equity piece. I think the discussion was robust, and it was introductory, and we'll learn a lot from it.
Yeah, I agree. And I think throughout the whole thing, we got a clear idea just in terms of what has already been produced. Some memorandums of understanding as it relates to department performance and so forth. But I noticed that there is an emphasis, a performance priority that was already written for the police department. And that's to provide information that gives the community greater insight into how the department serves the community. And when you take that along with their emphasis upon training and the work that's already been done, I think we're positioned to identify those concrete tasks through maybe a quarterly kind of chunk at a time, and start moving forward. But certainly the conversation, everybody was engaged, and I think we have a shared focus, and I think there's a good energy to really get started in the work. So it was very productive. And the hospitality and the openness was appreciated.
Yep. I know we talked real briefly about coming back to this group today and kind of going over some of the stuff that we've already done. Is that something we still want to share with everybody, or do you want to keep that within the subcommittee? Or stuff that we've already done, I mean, the police department that we've done.
The police department.
I mean, is that worth sharing with the group, or do we want to, I guess if
We have
you're
the
interested,
time.
you could come.
With, because if we do, it'd be great to just highlight a few of those things.
Highlights.
Yeah.
It'd be great.
Yep.
That's something we need to do as far as get items on the agenda, then just wing it from meeting to meeting. And if the subcommittee that we were part of and the outreach committee as well, that those items should be on the agenda every time, because until you dismiss the subcommittee, it's still active and it should be reporting back to the
Yes.
task. So those should be on there with a report at every task force meeting.
Please go ahead, Chief.
Yes.
Yeah, so some of the things that we've done, initially I reviewed policies, and so we added a lot of clarifying language to the policies. There was stuff in there that we trained or didn't train that wasn't necessarily spelled out, so we added that language into the policies. So things like requiring de-escalation be attempted, we were already doing that, but it wasn't spelled out in our use of force policy, so we had that in there. Things like prohibiting warning shots, I put that into the policy to prohibit any kind of warning shots, verbal warnings issued before any deadly force is used if it's safe or practical. Again, that's something that we train on, but it wasn't spelled out in our policy. So I added those. I added the language about specifically banning chokeholds. Again, was not a technique that we trained or ever utilized or approved, but given what happened up in Minneapolis, we thought it was important to put that in there. The intervention line, again, that's kind of in our rules about rules of conduct that an officer should intervene, but I added that to our excessive force policy as well, that if they feel like any force being used is excessive, regardless of who it is, they've got a duty to intervene and report it. Putting people in an upright position after they're secured, again, that was a training technique that we had, just wasn't in writing. And that any officer involved shooting or interaction that results in the death is going to be investigated by the Iowa DCI or another agency. I think that that's probably had been a practice. We don't have that too often here. In recent memory, I don't recall any of them. But again, I thought it was important to put that in. Some of the other measures that we looked at just to make sure that we were doing things right was our use of force, how we monitor and record that. And that's everything from pointing a gun at somebody using a taser and anything beyond pretty much open-handed techniques on people that we track that. We also went back and made sure that our reviews, when we have a use of force, it's reviewed by a lieutenant, one of our defensive tactics instructors, and a sergeant. They review those incidents individually. They'll look at the body camera footage, read the reports. They review it individually. They come up with their conclusions, and then they meet as a group, and they send that up to the deputy chief and myself as whether it was warranted or not. We already had a pretty robust camera program, body camera. We synced up this past year our body cameras with our car cameras, so that if the car camera is turned on and a car's you don't have your body camera on, it will click on your body camera, because sometimes officers get out and they don't activate it, or they think they activate it. This makes sure that it'll click on. We've got a delay within our body cameras that if they turn it on, it will actually go back. As long as it's in the standby mode, it will go back 30 seconds before you turn it on and record that, which is also important. It's another feature that we've got through these Axon cameras. Anytime the lights and sirens on a squad car are activated, any body cameras in the area are going to click on as long as they're in the standby mode. We did mandate this past year that officers keep their cameras in the standby mode. They don't record until they push the button in the middle to actually record. But as long as it's in that standby mode, it'll kick on automatically if a squad car comes. And again, that's a safety feature for the officers, and sometimes they get out and they think they're hitting that button, and if they get out and they get in a tussle or a chase, sometimes it doesn't get activated. This just kind of ensures that happens. We assign more sergeants to the patrol division. I added 3 sergeants to each division through the council. I thought it was important to have that frontline supervision out there, so that's helped. We've sent the officers to the trainer for implicit bias and de-escalation training. We've gone through the first round of those with our in-service training this year. I kind of explained a little bit for us, because we're a smaller agency, that 24/7 operation training times at a premium for us, and so it's hard to get people all in there at one time together to train. So we really put a premium value on those hours. So we've got that included. We've got another round coming up this fall that will continue on in that. The Foundation 2 contract, we've had our mental health crisis counselor since January. We started that last February before the derecho and the COVID and everything. We finally got our contract. She's had about 50 to 60 contacts. She's averaging about 65 to 70% of those people she's stabilizing without having to transport them to the hospital or jail, which is fantastic for us. We paid for that out of our own budget. We've been looking for some grant money. Right now, it looks like the DOJ grants, a lot of the ones that traditionally would have been already out and listed by now, haven't come out yet. And I don't know if it's with the changeover in the administration, if they're putting their own priorities in place, and they'll come out later this summer or not. So we keep watching it. We did budget for it next year in my budget, and then the council approved it. So regardless of whether we get a contract or a grant, we're gonna have her there. Brooke will be with us. Talked a little bit about some of the things with the high school and with 4 Oaks. So we were having some things that we just decided that, it was putting officers in kind of a difficult situation, that we were being called to basically do things that were not necessarily a police matter. And so, and specifically with like 4 Oaks, the walkaways, who walk away from the facility. Most of the kids, when they walk away, they're just burning off steam and they come back. But we were getting 4 Oaks calling us, wanting us to go out and chase kids down. We had 4 Oaks calling because they couldn't get the kids to go back into their rooms at night and wanting us to come down and basically intervene. And we're not going to do that anymore. We're going to meet with the 4 Oaks president. We're going to talk about what we can and can't do. But I think that that's something we needed to get laid out, because I don't want to leave them hanging without an option, but it kind of puts us in an awkward position if we don't have a crime or we don't have an actual threat. The records management system, again, that's in the strategic plan for the city. That's a big need for us. We don't have the ability to pull data the way we need to be able to proactively look at things and to pull data to share with you guys. We put some data out on our webpage that it's very basic though, and the stuff that we need to be able to do, we can't do with the system we have now. So we've moved forward with that. We secured funding through the council in next year's budget, starting in July. We've done a needs assessment. We've been to a site visit out in central Iowa with another agency that's already using a particular product. We've partnered up with another city here in the metro area to share some of those costs. And we're moving forward with that. We're basically at this point, we're down to looking at the individual modules that we want to pick and what kind of hardware we need to host the thing here. So I would think that thing's going to be signed off. We'll have a contract probably within the next few months, and then we'll start really building towards that. It's about a 12 to 18 month rollout, depending on how much stuff we get with that. But we're excited about that, and that's going great guns forward. Then again, the use of force stats, the arrest reports, we give that information and have been giving it to the city council in the monthly reports. I think I presented to the Civil Rights Commission, to this group, and now Amber's putting it on our webpage, and we're updating that every month. So we talked about trying to do that more often, updating that on a weekly basis, but the numbers are just not that huge. And so I don't know that there's been a real reason to do that yet. We can if everybody thinks it's necessary, but again, we're trying to get the information out there that we can pull. I think that's it.
Thank you. Thank you, Chief. We'll move to our
Amal, Jennifer raised her hand.
Jennifer, you can go ahead.
Thank you, Chief, for all of that reporting. I love hearing you like describe every effort that's being made because I really think that you're doing a ton, and that's awesome. And so, and that you're going to have it on the monthly being updated on your website. I'm wondering if there's any way that this task force could, I don't know, I'm thinking of ways of making sure that the link is getting out there. So that way community members really understand like what steps are being taken and like where to go to get that information, because I think a lot of people maybe don't know, and maybe that's where our task force could be a help in communicating what the what the police department is doing.
Yeah,
That was good.
yep. I think we can, and we can get, I know we put something out on our social media about where to find those statistics, but I can work with Amber as well, Amber Bissinger from the city, to try to get that advertised a little bit more. And like I say, I'm looking for what other people want to see on there, and it's not, and we'll start mining that stuff out. It just takes us some time. We have to get a couple of people involved to pull stuff out, but I'll do it. Whatever everybody wants, we'll try to get it out there.
All right, thank you. We'll move ahead to our third and last item on the agenda, facilitator update. Me and the city are very excited to inform you that we are engaging Tom Newkirk as a consultant to help us with our equity efforts. And if you had the time to read through his bio, you'll see that Tom is more than qualified to facilitate and advise our work towards equity and inclusion. Tom has an extensive civil rights background, and he spent more than 20 years developing methods to reducing bias as a risk. I'll let Tom, he's online, I'll let him introduce himself to you, and he'll give us a sneak peek into his approach. You can take it from here, Tom.
Thank you, Amal. Make sure I'm sharing the right slide here. Hold on a second. Yeah. Okay. So Amal's correct. We kind of put this together and began speaking about it. And I wanted to show up at this particular meeting. I've just begun to look into the process. So like you said, I'm just giving you a sneak peek into kind of generally my approach, because I won't get into the meat of some of these more difficult issues until I develop some level of rapport and trust with all of you. And so I'm kind of just going to go through a little kind of a mini slideshow just to kind of talk about some of the approaches that I use in this process, how I kind of got here. And then hopefully this will trigger some ideas within all of you. I do want to say thanks to them all for engaging me, and I want to say I'm very impressed with the city of Marion. The chief, what you're talking about, all of your engagement is really impressive. And you guys are on the right path for sure. So give me a second here. Make sure I'm going in the right way. Okay. So I'm a civil rights lawyer by trade, but over the last 20 years, I've developed a specialization in implicit bias and the effects of bias and designing remedies for those processes. I'm sure you've had implicit bias training. The chief mentioned that.
I'd say the drinking bell has been rung.
Is it us?
No, I think it's him, because we can still see Jennifer. So I think he was disconnected. Dropped out.
We'll give him a couple of minutes to reconnect.
He was just working up a head of steam.
Sorry, Maxwell, can you repeat yourself?
Oh, I just said he was just working up a head of steam. Can you hear
We're
me?
waiting
Okay?
to see if he joins back in.
While we're waiting, do we anticipate that he will be with us face to face in the future next time, or is it going to be virtual?
Yes.
Face to face?
Is it possible for us to experience what he may be offering to the city as sort of a sample in?
Hey, sorry about that. I had a internet glitch, I think. I assume I'm back. Sorry about that, guys. Okay, start over again here. 1 second. I assume I was cut off that whole time, right, Amal?
Yep.
Okay, thanks. Anyway, so my specialization is in implicit bias and designing remedies. And I'm giving you a whirlwind tour of kind of how I approach it. You know, today I'm just going to talk about raising some awareness on these issues and, you know, talking a little bit about the role of structure in creating bias or enabling bias, because I know that Amal had spoken about, you know, your efforts to deal with individual issues like the perception of profiling, policing, the impact of bias within city policies and procedures and things like that. So I just want to talk about that briefly and kind of give you some ideas of how to think about that stuff. So I begin my presentations with a reference to this particular topic. So imagine this is Robert Koch. He's the person who looked through a microscope 150 years ago and determined that bacteria was causing tuberculosis. So I'm sure you've all heard of the Mayo Clinic. So let's imagine you're going to the Mayo Clinic and you're taking your family member up there for some serious treatment. They're going to have surgery, and you're going to watch that surgery through the camera, through the one of those glass-walled windows. And you're watching the surgery of your loved one, and all of a sudden you look in there and you realize that no one in there has washed their hands. Now, you're not a microbiologist, you're not a medical doctor, but you know instantly what's wrong with that picture. And so you go pound on the window and you try and find out what's going on, and nobody knows what you're talking about. That's kind of where we are with implicit bias. Implicit bias causes harm and affects decision making across a whole host of decisions. And yet we don't really understand it. Just 1 second, please. Okay, there we are. We don't really understand it. So what I'm here to do is to talk about, 1 second, please. Here we go.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
Okay, I start with this as well because what are you trying to do? What is your goal? Instead of saying we're going to train on bias, we're going to do all these things, what do you really want to do? What do you want to accomplish should be what you should be talking about first. So what is your challenge? How can you have a goal to eliminate implicit bias if you don't really understand it, if people don't really understand it at a micro level? But what if there was a bias that only caused harm to certain groups, African Americans, women, and certain groups? And some groups, like me, are actually immune from bias to a large extent. Just again, like bacteria. Bacteria doesn't harm everybody, but it harms some of us. What if bias was extensive, like bacteria? It extended throughout a system. Most of it have it in our brains in some way, shape, or form. What if it's subconscious, meaning it operates even if we don't intend for it to cause harm, but it causes the same harm as overt racism, overt sexism, etc.? What if it undermines equality? What if it undermines your entire ability to make progress? That is implicit bias. That's the problem you face. And what's really hard is getting your mind around how that actually affects you at a micro level. So how do you get to the moon? I mean, how do you get to this goal of equality? Well, I use implicit bias is like bacteria in a way. It's invisible. Not all bias is bad, as I'm going to talk to you about just real briefly. It's not all bias is bad. Some of it's good, just like bacteria, we need bacteria. Some of us, like me, are immune. So given that reality, what should be our goal? Are we going to try and eliminate all biases? We can't do that, folks. You can't eliminate it. Just like you can't eliminate bacteria in the Mayo Clinic or anywhere else. You've got to manage it and control it and understand how it works. We need to find a way to eliminate and control the harmful forms of bacteria, of bias. That's what we need to try and figure out. So how do you begin? I took this quote from something that Amal sent me, racial equality. A state where a person's racial identity does not predict how a person fares, and just, impartial, and fair opportunities exist for all individuals. At the end of the day, that's what everyone wants. That's what persons who look like me want. That's what persons of color want, African Americans want, women want, etc. To walk into a city clerk's office and have them say, I'm going to evaluate you regardless of your race, gender, sexual orientation, age, etc. I'm not going to be more irritated with you because you're black. I'm not going to be more dismissive of you because you're over 70 years old. I'm not going to be more dismissive of you because you're a woman. And that's true whether in dealing with the police. It's not just about shootings. It's about interactions. It's about body language. It's about a whole host of things that bias can affect. And that's what you want to get to the point of getting to the point where you can walk in and be evaluated purely equally based on who you are as a person. So I always begin this because I think that in your task, over my 20 years, I've identified 5 major barriers to why we cannot make progress. And they really have nothing to do with necessarily the science of implicit bias. They have to do with human beings and why we can't take a step forward. Anytime there's a discussion, I'm sure as a task force, you've probably already come across this in how you got here, how you're trying to respond to it, your discussions in your room here and your various committees. Most people are defensive about implicit bias. They're defensive about all forms of bias. We interpret it in a very negative way. We interpret it as an attack. That's number one. Everyone's defensive. All teachers I train are defensive. Police officers, lawyers, doctors, most people are defensive in some way. The second problem is polarization. We always polarize it. It's either racism or it's not racism. It's sexism, it's not sexism. It's either one or the other. It's never the actual source of harm, which is the implicit forms of bias that flow in the middle. Yes, there are racists in the world. There are racist lawyers and racist doctors, and there are racist police officers. But I assure you all that Tom Newkirk, so-called civil rights lawyer, who works hard every day believes in equality, if I'm in denial of my own biases, I'm just as dangerous as someone who may be overtly racist, maybe more so. And so one needs to be able to get one's brain around the concept of how bias affects decisions and how to take responsibility for it. The third barrier is a lack of knowledge. I know that we've had some training on bias, but my friends, I've been talking to hundreds of people for 20 years, and getting one's mind around bias, we do not have an empathic understanding of it. When you walk into a building and you see one of those bacterial soap dispensers, you know exactly what it is. I don't need to be a microbiologist. I don't need to look through a microscope. I know what bacteria is. I know it causes harm. I get why I wash my hands. I get why I cover my mouth, etc. But with bias, we don't have that yet. All of the things, for example, all of our decisions can be affected by bias in some subtle way. The fourth barrier is bias itself. Okay, this is another problem. Any audience to whom I speak, 70% of the room will have some form of bias towards some specific group that's operating on their subconscious mind that interferes with their ability to process information. That's another barrier, which is why my presentations, my approaches are designed to be counterintuitive, to kind of go around those barriers. That's why they move in a certain way. The fifth barrier I don't have here, but it's particularly important for a city. It's the overwhelming nature of the problem. If you have $1 billion to spend, you can go perhaps eliminate and create equality for every single person in your particular community. You don't have $1 billion to spend. Very few people does. Other than Amazon, you don't have $1 billion to spend on it. So the question is, how can you take this overwhelming problem in the task force here in dealing with issues of race bias, issues of gender, issues of age? How do you do it and actually do it in a way that is efficient, that actually can be done in the real world, in real time in the city, but also can be done in a way that actually makes a real difference for example, African Americans who are saying, now's the time, I'm tired of waiting, or for other groups who may be tired of waiting for that full equality opportunity. How can you do that? That's one thing that I hopefully can help bring to the table, which is looking at, helping you guide your resources in an efficient way to actually make the most impact for your time and energy you're spending in this process, rather than trying to take on the entire universe of solutions, which may end up stopping you. To reduce defensiveness, I do this. I'm from Iowa. I'm not some lawyer from Des Moines telling the city of Marion how to run its life. I'm not from New York or California. All three of my kids are named after towns in Iowa. And no, it's not Iowa Falls. You can probably figure out which three they are, but those are the three names of my sons. And I've been developed this theory in Iowa, and I teach people around the country in this issue because I don't know what it is about Iowa. We don't have some overtly horrid racist history or sexist history, but we've had our problems. We also had our successes. We also believe in fairness, but we're probably sometimes a little bit more in denial about biases than some, but I think we're willing to learn. So I think there's something about being in Iowa in the Midwest that makes us a little more open to this concept. At least I hope so. So I got into this 20 years ago. I'm walking out of a Dolls in Des Moines, Iowa. If everybody remembers Dolls, before it went to Price Chopper here in Des Moines. And an African-American man is walking behind me. It's about 9 o'clock at night. I'm walking out of the store. It's a little dark. And I walk toward my car, and you can't see me in the video, I don't think, but I walk toward my car, and I go like this. I'm slapping where my wallet would be. And I get in my car, and I sit down, and I said, why in the hell did I just do that? Why would I do that? I've never been robbed by a black or a white person. I wasn't raised in an overtly racist home. I don't believe that I'm more likely to be robbed by a person who's African American. Intellectually, I don't believe it. I was a civil rights lawyer at the time, and probably then and now have represented more African Americans than any employment lawyer in the Midwest, probably. But I still put my hand on my wallet because of the automatic association between black and crime that was in the back of my brain. And I didn't really know it at the time. I didn't think about it at the time, but I became aware of it at the time. And then it took me 20 years to try and figure out what to do about it. Because what I said was, I'm sitting in my car, is if I'm doing that, how many other millions of people are doing the same thing? Lawyers, doctors, teachers, police officers, etc. People and they're doing it in different ways, different contexts. And so that started me down a path of trying to figure out what to do about it, but also how to create messaging that, for example, if someone come to me 20 years ago and said, Tom, you're biased, blah, 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 I would have said, what are you talking about? I'm a civil rights lawyer. I don't do that. But if they could have found a different way to talk to me, maybe I could have made progress. And so that's one thing I've tried to do. The second thing I did was some research to kind of figure out the power of how bias and how it works. And this study I came across 20 years ago in the New England Journal of Medicine found that cardiologists, when they brought in African Americans, whites, male and female, and they gave them the same symptoms, wore the same white gowns, they had the same insurance and everything else, they gave the best treatment for their symptoms to people who look like me, white males. Second best to white females, and third best to African Americans. And I said to myself, and the study found that race and sex were causing these physicians to diagnose and treat their patients differently. And I said, I don't believe all those doctors are racist and sexist. Some of them may be, not all of them. Something else is going on. So what would cause a physician with an ethical obligation to treat people equally and no interest, no gain or loss to misdiagnose, treat people, and if they're doing it and I'm putting my hand on my wallet, how powerful of a force is this thing that is bias? I hope you can hear this, because this is a great example of kind of bias in action. I wanted you to hear. This is recorded on a phone, and so it's hard to hear, but do your best. Turn up volume on your computers if you can, please.
But I had a black woman come in with back pain who every time she coughed, she would get chest pain. And she was just there with back pain. She would cough, she's like, oh, my chest. And she had a very histrionic personality. And so all the providers were inclined to just be like, oh, okay, let's just give her some cough medicine, So one day I was like, let me put an EKG on you, because I think the New England Journal study just came out that black women have the worst health outcomes with heart attacks because they're not listened to. So I'm like, okay, let me just try this. So I put an EKG on her, and every time she coughed, she had ST elevation. She was having a heart attack. I said, oh my God. So I called the cardiologist and I said, can you please cath this lady? Because I think she has a bridge artery going through her, myocardium, so that when her interthoracic pressure is increased, it's collapsing the artery and she's having cardiac issues. And he said, well, send her to my outpatient clinic. I said, this woman will never show up to your outpatient clinic. I know this woman, I've known her for 5 years, she will never show up. She's here in the hospital, she's gonna be here for a couple days with back pain, let's just do a cath. And he refused to do the cath. And so finally I said, I don't want this woman to become a statistic that black women get worse medical care around heart attacks than everybody else because the medical institution doesn't listen to them. And he said, are you calling me a racist? And I said, well,
So I put that up there because it's a real world example by a real doctor, a woman of color, who said what? I'm aware bias exists and that this can affect black women. I'm going to check my bias. I'm going to make a decision. I'm going to test her when I wouldn't have tested her. I realize she's having a heart attack. She needs treatment. I go to another doctor who looks probably more like me, probably, and say, will you treat her? He says no. She says, well, I don't want her to be a statistic because black women don't get treatment. She challenges him on bias, and what's his response? Defensive, polarized, you calling me a racist. That is the microcosm of what we need to do with regard to bias at a micro level, but also the challenge we face and you face in terms of being able to have these conversations across the city, across the individual employees, without creating defensiveness, without getting people opposing each other, but also developing methods that you can then use to actually reduce the biases that may exist within a system. I'm going to skip this to keep moving, but the video that I was going to show basically says this, that not all bias is bad. We have to process 11 million pieces of information in our brain any one time. That means we need shortcuts. And we have, we can't live without it. We can't process information without our subconscious working hard to do it. And the problem is that these biases affect information processing. They affect, how we react to a human being, what information we see, whether we decide to stop someone for to arrest them, etc. It affects a whole host of decisions. But the problem is, what we've decided as a society is that some forms of bias, implicit bias, in particular implicit bias connected to our protected status of race, gender, age, etc., are bad. That's the bad form of bacteria. So how do we separate out the bad bacteria bias from and leave the good? Because we can't eliminate all bias. We just cannot do it. And in fact, even right now, no training is going to eliminate bias in your brain. It's just not going to happen at this point in our society. So what do we do? So we're trying to deal with bias toward whites, non-whites, females. And one way to understand it is to know that it does come from old school racism and sexism that left the front of our minds and moved to the back of our minds. It's in many of us, it impacts our decisions, and the real challenge here is that it's automatic. It means that just like those doctors in the test, just like me and my wallet, if you're not paying attention, it will trigger, it will affect, it will cause harm. And to other groups who are affected by it, hey, it looks and smells like racism. It looks and smells like sexism. It looks and smells like something else. And sometimes it is, but the bias is extensive and causes harm. In my bio, I mentioned that one of the recommendations that I'm provided is by Tony Greenwald, who's the inventor of the implicit association test, which is effectively where the word implicit bias comes from. He designed a test that allowed us to measure whether or not we may have biases toward African Americans, toward women in certain roles, etc., toward older persons. And you can go take the test online. go to Project Implicit and take the test online. And if you do, it asks you to self-report whether you think you're biased toward, for example, African Americans, and then you take a test. And the test measures your automatic responses to black and white faces and good and bad things. Well, Dr. Greenwald made this map for me based on the data they collect, because when you go take the test, you tell them where you're from. Not your name and that kind of stuff, but just like I'm from Iowa, I'm from Polk County, etc. And this is a map showing anything that is pink to red means you're strongly biased against African Americans and are in favor of whites. Everything on left is how we self-report ourselves as not biased. Everything on the right is how we actually test here in Iowa. And see, the good thing is not every county is all red or pink, some are blue, which means, again, it's not 100% implicit bias, but it's extensive. It goes throughout the system. And the point is that in those counties everywhere, including the county where you all are, the county here I am, Polk County, you know, there are teachers there, doctors, police officers, people doing their jobs, and people that are affected by bias that causes harm. So it's real and affects our decisions, so is that it? So bias also affects structure, and I want to talk briefly about that because I think that'll relate. And again, the reason I'm going through this process is it's a whirlwind tour, an introduction, a snapshot of kind of some of the approaches I use, not remotely the full extent, but I knew I only had a limited amount of time and I wanted to fit within your time frame to kind of introduce myself in this way. So structure, and maybe some of these things will trigger some ideas in your minds of what you need to do, where you need to go as we go forward. Structure is different. There's employment structure. Your recruitment, hiring, pay, and discipline are individual decisions, but there are rules that govern of how we recruit, how we hire, how we pay, and how we discipline. So the rules are the structure. There's social and legal structure. In other words, not just the act of a police officer arresting an African American or white person, but the approach to crime. What types of crimes do we police? Where do we police? What areas where do we go? Do we engage in broken window offenses? Do we decide to, and you're at a police department, do you decide to pull people over for a broken taillight, a cracked window, an out-of-date registration, etc.? Maybe you do, maybe you don't, but the point is that there's a structure that is different, that may either enable bias or be infected with some level of bias, that is different from whether or not the officer or the teacher or the city clerk is making a biased decision toward the individual person in front of them. And access to housing, schools, and social services can also be another form of structure. And for cities and towns, there's licensing issues, zoning issues, exceptions to zoning issues, and things that can affect, and of course, that can be structural ways that bias can hide. And policing, of course. So effectively, if you start to get your mind around, if you want to make a difference, you start to think about reducing bias by thinking about dealing with the structure, but also dealing with what I call decision points. Any decision point is at risk from bias depending on the source, meaning the person who's making the decision, reviewing it, and the object. So if I'm a city clerk and I'm deciding whether to react in a certain way to a customer, the bias may flow from me as a city clerk toward the customer who may be black or Hispanic or some other race or older, etc. That's the decision when I interact with that person. And individual decisions, you know, this is when you assess stated or documented ability or knowledge. You're assessing someone's characteristics, what they're doing. The police officer on the street's assessing whether he wants to pull someone over, whether he wants to stop them, etc. That's individual decisions affected by bias. You know, assessing behavior, vocal tone, demeanor, that kind of thing. That's at a very, very micro level how bias is affected. But it also affects structural decisions, okay? They're slightly different things. Number one, do we have a need for a rule, a policy, a zoning rule, a city policy, a hiring policy, a disciplinary policy? Do we need to go police this area of the town? Do we need to pull people over for broken taillights? In other words, the idea of whether we need the policy can be affected by bias itself. And it also can hide bias within it. The second level is the interpretation of the rule or policy. So therefore, example, if we have a rule that may have been affected by bias and therefore may have been put in place more because it creates more harm toward African Americans or Hispanics versus whites. Or maybe it's a neutral rule, and it is neutrally put in place, but when we interpret it, we interpret that rule or policy in a way that harms one group over another. So there's two different layers of decision points within that process. Here's an example. I do a lot of work in the school to prison pipeline, work with K-12 education in terms of dealing with how bias affects African Americans and young women in K through 12 education. It's a huge problem. The evidence of bias and suspensions of kids for African American in all schools in Iowa is overwhelming. And so here's an example. If a teacher is deciding to suspend a child, first of all, you have the structural problem. Does the school use suspensions? Like the chief, he said they don't use chokeholds. They did in Minnesota, at least for a while. So to some extent, does the policy of chokeholds exist or does it not exist? Does the policy of suspending kids for smoking or for using their phone or talking back to the teacher, in other words, someone above the teacher's pay grade is making these policies to decide whether kids get suspended. Then the teacher is evaluating the behavior of Jimmy, young white man, and Jamal, young black man, and making a differential evaluation of their behavior of whether they get suspended or get recommended for suspension. That's just one example of how the structure, the policies that someone might create can be affected by bias, maybe neutral, but then affected by the evaluation of bias. And you can apply that, again, I use that example because you can apply it to anything. It doesn't matter whether it's a zoning rule or a licensing rule or a ticketing rule, it doesn't matter. Structure is one source of bias, and then the implementation of the policy or procedure is a second form that you guys need to think about. A more serious version of this is the drug policies versus individual law enforcement. You know, we all know, hopefully know about this. In '86, we passed this crime where we made the penalties for crack cocaine 100 times more harsh than powder, which put, which put ungodly numbers of African Americans in prison as a result. But the problem was 85% of those sentenced for crack cocaine were black, even though the majority of users of the drug were and remain white today. So the structure was, we're going to create more penalties for this type of drug that we wrongly think is associated with being black, bias. The police then making individual decisions of who to arrest are basing those arrests on the same type of bias about crack cocaine versus powder cocaine. And then they're putting them in prison and arresting them, and they're actually guilty of something because they're caught with the drug. But you see that the bias is created because of the bias structure that was put in place and the implementation of it. And again, that's a very serious example, but you can apply that same theory to anything you all are looking at. What's the structure? What are the risks of bias? What are the individual forms of bias that can exist? And I'll skip through this really quickly. These are just examples of rules, like if you have boards and commissions in your city, you may, board of review, these are just general boards that exist in a number of cities. And one example is the Civil Service Commission. So here's a risk of structure. I'm assuming you must have a Civil Service Commission, maybe you do. Example of structural bias risks. Approving the creation of all entrance and promotional examinations used for civil service positions. Well, what if you create a test that has a weight limit that is unnecessary and it has an impact on women, or it has an impact on African Americans because there's some kind of other odd provision in the exam that can have an impact that's going to reduce the number of a certain group getting through the process. Then you have individual bias. The hearings involving suspension, demotion, and discharge of employees, that's going to be an individual evaluation of the behavior of a person who gets disciplined within this process. So there's an example of a relationship between structural bias, quote, the rules and policies that set the tone, and then of course the individual biases that cause the evaluation of information. So that's just whirlwind tour. So where I think you might want to start going, and you're already on your way, is, let's review the policies, procedures, laws, and regulations for the structures that impact certain groups. It may not be that many. It may just be, and going through the process of cleaning it out once, then you tell the public that, hey, this is what we've done, make progress, eliminate those areas where there were problems, And then that can be step one. You can look at policing policies, you can look at a whole host of things that may not necessarily be necessary to the city to implement the rule in that way, but maybe having an impact or a perceived impact on certain groups. And that's one, it's not easy to do, but it's relatively low-hanging fruit. It's something you can do and get right to it. And then secondly, we would look at the risks of bias in the implementation of those rules. Like some rules you have to keep. You're not going to change your criminal laws on, your criminal policies necessarily if they affect everyone and you want to stop this type of crime or this type of issue where you're policing. But you focus on how bias can affect the interpretation of certain rules, and not just policing, but other areas as well. And then we can talk about a more focused review of the more challenging areas. Like obviously your chief of police there is on it. He's got a lot of progress he's making, but you focus on police and public safety because that's obviously the big one that's affecting calls for social change, etc. But let me just tell you something. George Floyd was shot. We all saw the protests. Do you think there was any police department in the United States that was more motivated to try and not have this happen again than in Minnesota, Minneapolis? It still happened again, didn't it? The reason is because they actually didn't know how to fix the bacteria problem. That's part of the reason why. They can eliminate chokeholds. That's not the problem. You can't eliminate the use of guns. You can't eliminate things like that. You can talk about de-escalation. At the end of the day, if you don't understand and you haven't been able to convey to everyone how bias affects your feeling of whether you want to de-escalate or not, as you really get that into people's empathic understanding, the same thing can happen anywhere in the United States again. And so there's a way to deal with this in a more effective way that can make better progress, and you're to be commended for trying to go down this road. Advanced training of bias for personal decision-making rules. In other words, if the city has limited budgets, don't recommend training every single human being on implicit bias in the history of the universe and spending all that money on it. Focus on those people who are making the key decisions. Focus on those individuals. That's what I would do. It's a more efficient way to deal with it. And then I think that Amal had mentioned, or someone talked, but it's someone about a community-wide education on the nature of implicit bias. A more broader understanding of how bias affects decision-making, if delivered in the right way, can help not only everyone identify it when it exists, but also know when it doesn't exist. It can help those individuals in your community. I'm sure you have individuals who might resist this, this more progressive approach, if you want to call it that. There's a way to talk to those particular individuals to help them gain a respectful empathy for why making progress matters. And so and that's what I've done over the last 20 years. I mean, I tell people I have a lot of understanding of how bias works, but I also understand how to talk to people, a lot of whom happen to look like me. How do you break through, and Barry, how do you break through some of those resistance to that? Because actually, there's more common ground than you think if you can break through the defensive barriers. And then later on, we can talk about the implementation of bias management tools if you'd like to go that far. Decision point theory, which is way beyond this conversation, and accountability measures. And again, accountability measures that I talk about don't mean punishing people. Yeah, you can punish people who screw up, who say bad language, who are overtly biased and prejudiced. That sounds good. But there's other accountability measures you can put in place that help reduce the potential risk for bias. So anyway, my last form of bias is my favorite form of bias. It's called Ikea bias. It's actually a thing. And Ikea bias is a form of bias that says that when you're part of putting something together, you like the outcome much better. That's why when you put the furniture together at Ikea, you like it, even if you do a bad job putting it together, because you're the one who was participating in it. And so I always tell everybody that my approach to talking about these issues, consulting on these issues, engaging on these issues, is to start to inform you of things and ways of talking about it you may not have thought of, and then collaborate with you, the people who are there in the real world, to come up with a solution that actually works within your particular community. And I look forward to doing that. So anyway, that's the Whirlwind Tour. Thanks again for hearing me out. Sorry for the internet glitch. That doesn't happen too often, but occasionally it happens. And if anybody has any questions, I'm glad to talk about it, but I know you were supposed to be done at 6 as well. So
you, Tom. Anybody has any question for Tom? Questions,
So,
comments?
Yeah. Appreciate that. Thank you. It's something we've been talking about, is this understanding the root causes, if you will, of some of the disproportionate outcomes that we are here to address. I'm curious if you have an idea about how you think we would move forward as a task force with you, if you've had a chance to talk about that, Amal, is that what's being developed next? Like, what will our next meeting look like? Should we be thinking about, I think a 1 hour meeting is probably not
enough. Yes, definitely. This is just an introductory meeting. I think Tom will need some time to assess where we at. We've done some work, and he'll help us on scoping the work plan and where we start and how to get there. And he will be helping us on formulating a plan to assess our policies, practices, and put together a communication plan, and also guide us towards putting that action plan together and start on the path of implementation. So we discussed in numerous times that we are in need for transformative change, and we wanted to address the structural, the individual, and from all aspects, from all directions, and how to engage the other relevant partners and engage the community. I think Tom would be helping us through all of this.
And I would also note that it would be useful. I've only had a very brief introduction. I understand these concepts. I understand the conflicts that exist, and I can make lots of assumptions. But I haven't spoken to all of you to find out what's really going on the streets. What is the concern of what are the major concerns other than the obvious response to social justice? What progress is Chief Kitzmiller making? What barriers does he see in making that progress? Is there some way we can help make that more efficient and also more effective, not just efficient? And so getting some feedback from all of you on what you really think the problems are, what you think you should focus on, that would be very helpful to me, because otherwise I'm making educated, yes, but assumptions about what your particular community may be struggling with. And I only have what Amal has shared with me in a very, very, over the last couple of conversations before today. So that's the main thing that I would want to know before the next meeting.
And so you say before the next meeting, are you imagining interviewing each of us, or how are you imagining you would do that? Because I'll say, we've been doing this for a very long time. Mm-hmm. And frankly, we're ready to do something rather than continue to introduce each other and to the ideas. We've got the ideas out there. Should we have should our next meeting be a 3-hour meeting where we are with you, Tom? And
I don't need 3 hours of anybody's time. I can talk to people for 10 minutes and likely get to the point of what is most important, most significant, and where you may be spending your time, or maybe where you don't want to spend your time. That's one of the advantages I have, which is I've seen so many of situations that part of the question is, and again, I've only heard what you just said today and what the chief said. That's not giving me any real information as to, where do you want to focus your energy? If you have a list, if you have your key list, it may be as simple as me reading that and saying, "Hey, that's good. Let's go this direction," and then I can help you focus and move in at least help you suggest a direction that I would move into if you want to move more aggressively and directly to get to a point where you're making progress.
I think the issue is that we may not agree on this task force what that list is. So some of us came with a list, and others have, frankly, it's felt like they've been resistant to that list. And so I think that's the work we need to do together, is to really say, are we resistant to this list of things? Are there other things that should be on the list? Where are we going with that? And how can we do it together? Because I think we certainly believe that what we're bringing to the table is important, and getting at the issues you raise of sort of the heart of the matter.
I think that's a,
Fair enough, not everyone agrees, and
No,
that's
no.
reasonable. And so how do we come to a place where we can say, you know what, yeah, that now we see what we're saying, that makes sense. Let's look at those actions or policies or whatever that may be.
well, one thing that I can, and I totally appreciate you saying that, that's the type of honesty that I'm looking for. It's not about 3 hour conversation. You just told me 3 hours of information in 2 minutes, in 20 seconds there. Thank you. You're making Miss Stumbo, is that your name? Miss Stumbo, is that correct? Thank you for that. So one thing that I can help with bluntly is by looking at that list and perhaps helping to either translate the significance of that list to, if anyone here happens to appear to be resistant when they, or else realizing they're not as resistant as you think, but it may be how the list is being framed, how it's being presented, and there may be a more effective way of getting to the same exact thing you want and believe is, and I would agree with you, might be a good thing, but removing that resistance. That's kind of one thing that it's hard to quantify how I do that, but effectively, I've been walking these lines for 20 years, and I know, because at the end of the day, you want to get to a solution that actually matters, and and so I think it may just be a matter of let's see your list, and let me look at that, and let's have a conversation about it. Amal, does that make sense as a starting point, or?
Yes, definitely.
Okay. Yeah.
Jennifer, you've had your hand up. Go ahead.
Thank you. First off, I would say I would be open to being able to make sure that you hear what it is that we are trying to say about what our goals should be too. And so I think that it is important because kind of like how, a lot of what I do is I look at things through a gender lens, and you're looking at things through a different lens too that can maybe help us like, oh, this is what you mean behind this. So I think that would be really good. And then the other, and now my hand was up and then I forgot that my hand was up. And so now I'm trying to remember what I was going to ask about.
I'll talk, and you interrupt me when you've thought of it, because when I start
Okay.
talking, you'll think of it. You guys are really doing a great thing here. I mean, I know you know that, but I hope you really know that I talk to lawyers all over the country and people that are supposed to have their hearts in the right place that aren't even making 20% of the progress that you've made already. Truly, because this issue is so difficult. And I started my presentation with the idea of the defensiveness of polarization, because I'm telling you, that's the major barrier. And some of that is even subconscious. You've got to work through those barriers. And I think we don't need hours and hours and hours to do it, Ms. Stumbo. You really don't. We don't need to have a come to Jesus meeting for the next 4 weeks till we figure something out. Really, I think you can figure out. So maybe sending me your lists and your things, and maybe just I'll talk to them all a little bit more and kind of figure out how can we get to the heart of the matter. Maybe we can make some progress on it. I'm sure we can, by the way, but just that's what I think by the next meeting, can we make progress on that and then or realize where the conflict is and come up with, see if we can find a way around it.
Yeah, definitely. We're looking forward to your recommendations.
I remembered now what I was going to
Of course,
ask.
I knew.
So it totally worked. So thank you. Once you started talking, I was like, oh yeah, this is what I wanted to say. So is there any, I also was wondering, is there any way that you could provide any kind of guidance on best practices for continuing to be able to have these conversations when there seems to be some entities that want to put restrictions on being able to talk about systemic issues and bias issues?
Well, can you be more direct and tell me what you mean by that?
Well, recently there has been some changes made into our education system about what can be taught. There is an executive order that was put in place in the last administration that I know doesn't really have a leg to stand on, but it put a lot of fear in a lot of people about whether or not they could talk about this. And so how to be able to, I don't know, just keep going without getting shut down or threatened that, whatever.
I understand exactly what you're saying. I will say this. And I would say, if I was speaking to a group of individuals who believed in that law, passed that law, and I would speak to them in one particular way, okay? And I would say, I'd say, well, I'm not calling anybody systemically racist. I'm talking about the operation of a scientifically proven process of implicit bias that affects people, and all we're talking about is being responsible. That's it. You know, maybe there's some who, you know, I'd say if individuals want to use the word systemic racism, I don't blame them. There's good reason to be concerned about that. I mean, you know, hey, I'm not blaming any African American for using the word systemic racism, but there's at all. And if I was, by the way, if I was talking to the NAACP or Black Lives Matter in a group entirely composed of African Americans and persons of color, I'd say exactly the same thing. I'd say the way forward to actually make progress, to achieve actual equality that you've been waiting on for 200, 300 years, and even in the last 50 years, is to address this elephant in the room that is bias, that affects and infects decisions, and it is our defensive process, our polarized process that prevents us from making progress. But if you actually can make progress, and by the way, you focused on gender issues, you know, I focus on African Americans and persons of color for race, and focus on women for gender. I'm not ignoring gays and lesbians, not ignoring Native Americans or any other group. But if you actually want to make progress in 2 years instead of another 200, you have to focus on the groups that are the most at risk from bias. And that today is African Americans, to a lesser extent Hispanics, and women, and then other groups to some lesser extents. That's the way it is. So there's ways to talk about this, Jennifer, Ms. Tibbetts, and you know, and kind of work around it. But I want all of you to know, and you know, the advocacy groups for the racial equality. I'm not an apologist to try and give people that are biased a pass. I believe in actual responsibility, and that's why I speak directly to law enforcement and other groups as well. And there's a way to talk about this that is effective and real and actually makes progress, and that kind of gets around the, oh, don't call every white person racist, please, which I get why people have that reaction. I get it, but it's just a reaction that you need to kind of like corral and not really ignore, but there's ways around it, Jennifer, and we can talk about that more. And I hope you all understand. I know we're past our 6 o'clock here. I'm glad to keep going, but part of the process of this conversation is to build rapport, trust, honesty, directness. You know, you don't have any reason to have confidence in me other than some ridiculous bio or Amal's recommendation, but speaking to you in a real way is what will give you the confidence that if I'm speaking to Chief Kitzmiller, he can have confidence. I'll speak to him directly and cleanly. And if I speak to Ms. Stumbo and regarding her concerns, that I'll speak to her in the same way. So hopefully that's a long answer to your short question.
Thank you. Anybody has any other question?
Do I have permission to, for example, I'm going to reach out to Ms. Stumbo and ask for some of her thoughts, and is that appropriate? Do we need to have this on a conversation where we're all in the same room? Can I do that? Can I reach out to Chief Kitzmiller? I mean, I'm assuming I can do things like that, but I didn't know if that's what you thought would be okay.
Yes.
Okay. If I can get your emails from Amal, that would be useful.
Yep. I'll give you all the contacts.
Okay. Yes. Mm-hmm. So just to kind of, I'll have some conversations with people between now and the next upcoming task force meeting. If we can find a way to kind of break through some of that, those barriers with Ms. Stumbo mentioned and that may exist, or let's do that. And then and then I wouldn't mind talking to Chief Kitzmiller as well as to better understand all the progress that he's listed earlier. It'd be important to understand that as well. And I can talk to Amal about maybe talking to the city manager about the policies and procedures that are in the city as a whole. That's a really good start, I think.
Sounds good.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you all for listening. Thank you for your conversation.
Appreciate it.
Business before we wrap up. Is the appropriate time to bring it up?
What kind of business? Because we don't have it on the agenda.
Right. Well, we also didn't get a chance to approve the agenda. And so I had sent it, there are two pieces of business. One is I had sent a email to everyone suggesting that we maybe have a couple of additional standing items. I think, Steve, you offered that maybe subcommittee reports might be another one we think of. I was suggesting review and approve agenda, and other business ought to be on standing agendas.
Okay, we can add it to the next meeting agenda because it's not on the agenda. We can discuss it. And I would caution everybody from emailing the whole task force just because of open meetings law.
Gotcha.
So yeah, we'll have to add it to the next meeting agenda.
Thought about that.
Yeah.
So how do we bring it up if we have a question that we want to get on the agenda?
You can bring it up to me or Alicia. We'll add it to an agenda. So we'll add it to the agenda meeting and we'll have an official discussion on it.
Okay. So next, if that happens, then next time we bring it up. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, because the other question I have was a statement was made about alternates, and I actually would like to suggest that, I don't know how much longer we're going to need to be socially distanced, but if alternates could be in the room, that's my other piece of business, is that folks had asked that alternates be at every meeting, and you know that the idea is that when one of us can't be here and someone's filling in, that you all know who they are and that we know that they've been following up. And so that was the question I had is there a reason that they should not be in the room? Because that's part of them seeing and hearing us and us seeing them.
Yeah, it's a public meeting.
But I think
So we'll add it.
there was a reason for that you guys were coming back in a limited capacity, and therefore they didn't want to include additional people other than the board members for this meeting today. And that's why the Zoom was available for alternates to go through the Zoom part to stay in touch. But the city was limiting how they were opening up their meetings. That's what Lon had addressed at the last one, and why the numbers not having the additional people in the initial meeting. I'm sure going forward, that's probably not going to be an issue. But on the first one, they were concerned about their responsibility and liability in the meeting, and to have it opened up to wide to everybody.
Yeah, and I totally understand that about opening up to the public. I'm just offering that, and we currently have 2 alternates to the task force. You may want to have others.
So sorry to interrupt. Technically, this is a violation of open meeting law because we are continuing to discuss something that's not on the agenda. But to clarify what Steve is saying, we are limited in our capacity of opening it up. So we are restricting it to just board members for all of our committees right now. So any proxy not attending in place of somebody would be considered public. And I do see that Anna participated virtually this evening.
Yep.
Yeah, we can add it to the next meeting agenda.
Apologies, I'm still figuring out how the open meeting stuff works.
Okay. I think I can entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Meeting adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
We'll see you on the next meeting.